Hello everyone, dear friends, welcome to this session arranged by FUF and SIWI. My name is Adam Leckius and I will be moderating this session. Very exciting to be here today. The session is named Climate Chaos, titled I think, with a question mark on the end. So there is some basis in the title for actually trying to find some hope in the situation that we're in. So we'll try to do that together. I will actually take the opportunity now in this introduction to introduce myself, but mainly my organization that I'm working for, Push Sweden, for two reasons. First of all, no one knows about us. We're a small youth organization, some of us do, the ones that are members in the network. And also because a sub-theme for this session is to explore the role of NGOs and other non-party stakeholders that are engaging with the international climate politics that are being handled at this coming conference. So that's also a perspective that I obviously represent. So PUSH is a Swedish youth sustainability network taking on the responsibility of trying to clean up after previous generations in terms of climate impacts and doing everything in our power, which is quite limited, to kind of secure a livable future for our... Thank you. I'm sure that's a very important talk, but let's save it for later. For our future and for us, our generation and our children. So, due to the character of climate change, we're a young organization. We celebrate 5 years this year. Due to the character of climate change, it was just as natural for Push Sweden to start by looking outwards internationally, forming an international group. Because while Sweden definitely plays a big role in relation to its size, we're a small country, still climate change and the atmosphere does not care about national borders. Climate change is a global crisis and it needs to be solved internationally. But in conjunction with the historic 2015 Paris conference, COP21, which I'm sure many of you remember, we first got accredited as an observer organization in the UN climate change negotiations. And since then we have continued to send delegations of talented and passionate young people to these conferences and doing what we can to represent the young voice. And I'm currently in a position of coordinating this rather tedious and hard work that we do, which is obviously a privilege and an honor. Now, COP24, which is the 24th Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, it is approaching very quickly now in December, and we will soon hear more about it. Because Mathias will give us a mini lecture on the COP, on the Paris Agreement, and on the current science that is at least supposed to inform global policymaking on climate change. So I will leave the kind of educational aspect to him. But I will just say, speaking on behalf of PUSH, and not only us, but many other NGOs like us, that we are very much looking forward to this incredibly important conference in Katowice, in Poland. This is a very important COP for several reasons. Generally, as you all probably are aware of, time is now really running out in terms of solving climate change, which makes every high-level event, as well as all policy decisions on national levels, extremely important and urgent to integrate climate change into everything we're doing on the political stage. We simply don't have time for more delays. But specifically, this conference is interesting and very important in a specific way. The negotiations that will take place in Poland will set the rules and the conditions for the future of the Paris Agreement to actually deliver also in the future. So we both need action now on the ground, but we also need these negotiations to go as well as they possibly can. And that is what we are working on and what we will talk about today. So the current executive secretary, the chief of the UN climate negotiations and the convention, Patricia Espinosa, she has dubbed this conference as Paris 2.0, which says something about the importance and the weight of this conference. So, to finalize before we start, to put things into perspective, we have all gathered here, I think it's safe to say, with a strong interest and a strong passion for solving this problem of ours. We have gathered here to discuss and learn more about this, this very important conference dealing with politics of this very important, crucial issue of our time. That makes me very excited, and I hope you are all as well. So I'm excited about first hearing the interesting presentation from Mathias, and then some fruitful panel discussion moderated by myself, and then obviously questions from all of you to these wonderful panelists that we will hear from. Very exciting, and I should say that we have a live stream up and running, so wherever you are, welcome, and welcome to the stream and to this session. So thank you so much, and now I present Mathias Fridahl from Forus, who will present for us.
Okay.
Yes, please, go ahead. I mean,
Okay. So I've been asked to give you an introduction to the UN climate change regime. I work at Forus, the green think tank here in Stockholm, but also at Linköping University. So I travel to these conferences regularly, both to communicate research, but also to collect data for my research. So I have a dual position at these conferences. I recognize several faces from the conferences, so you will probably sort of think this is very easy to follow, and others I don't recognize. So I've been asked to give a very general introduction, which I will do. I will talk about these four concepts: goals, climate policy objectives or goals, carbon budgets, I will talk about scenarios, and I will talk about the means to reach these goals that we have on international levels. I'm going to start with the goals. Some of you know this. International politics, UN politics on climate change is organized around a structure of a framework convention to implementing protocols. So you basically start by gathering states to negotiate whether there is a problem at all, and to define common objectives and things like that. Also some principles for responsibility distribution, so on and so forth. Some information sharing requirements and so on. And the goal with the Framework Convention on Climate Change is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, basically. There is also a goal, or there was a goal, for industrialized countries as an aggregate to stabilize emissions in roughly year 2000 on 1990 levels. And then moving on towards more implementation-oriented treaties, the Kyoto protocols require industrialized countries to reduce emissions by 5.2% in the period 2008 to 2012. The nice idea with this aggregate goal was that it was combined with individual commitments. So it was not only up to industrialized countries as a group, but each and every industrialized country also had their own specific commitments. Right now we are in the second commitment period, regulated by the Doha amendment to the Kyoto Protocol. It says that we should reduce emissions by 18% in the period 2013 to 2020 compared to 1990 levels again. Okay, so you can see a progression here from 1990, stabilize in year 2000 onwards. Then we have the Paris Agreement, which is not strictly speaking a protocol, but it serves to implement the Framework Convention. It serves under the Framework Convention, the UNFCCC. And it's a completely different kind of goal, or it doesn't really have commitments actually. It has aspirational goals. And you know, all of you probably know that the temperature goal, it moves from an emission target to temperature goals, and it says that we should stabilize global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. Very different from the more clear-cut individual commitments in terms of emission reductions. It also says that we should aspire to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Then it also has adaptation-related global goal in terms of reducing vulnerability, increasing adaptive capacity, increasing resilience, and so on. And then there is a finance goal, actually, to redirect finance from dirty to clean investments, basically. I'm going to say more about the goal and the Paris Agreement in a while when we talk about carbon budgets, and I'm going to introduce you to what carbon budgets is. I've also been asked to say what a COP is, so I'm going to do that very quickly for those of you who don't know this. And Adam already says it's a conference of the parties, and we have actually 3 treaties. We have the UNFCCC itself, the Framework Convention, that's one COP. Then we have the Kyoto Protocol, that's the second COP. And then we have the Paris Agreement, so that's the third COP. So 3 COPs are meeting in parallel in Katowice in a couple of weeks' time. And they are the main deciding bodies. They meet annually to take decisions. Then we have subsidiary bodies that meet biannually, and we have some ad hoc subsidiary bodies also that meets whenever there is need to meet, and finance and so on. And nowadays it's mainly party delegates, state representatives. But there is also some intergovernmental representatives. The Secretariat has a big staffing, including UN police and so on. This is data from COP22 in Marrakesh in 2016. It's roughly what a COP looks like these days. You have the media and the non-governmental organizations that we will talk more about today. And it's not a small conference. It's actually the Marrakesh conference gathered almost 25,000 delegates. So it's a really big endeavor. And when it comes to those that actually negotiate, like Johanna here, that you will meet later on, they have to negotiate under the rule that all decisions on substantive matters has to be taken in consensus or by consensus, which means basically that you should have, in terms of ambition, low expectations on these negotiations, because it empowers those states that have the least sort of ambitious policy agenda. But you should also expect agreements that are really states should feel really responsible for the agreements or the decisions that they actually take, and you should expect them to be implemented. Okay, that's about the COP. I'm not going to talk more about that, but more on the well below 2 degree and 1.5 degree goal. If you think of these goals, you can actually construct carbon budgets. And I'm going to give you the carbon budget for the 1.5 degree goal to put what's happening in Katowice in a couple of weeks in context. Okay, so if you look at the 1.5 degree goal and you want to meet it with a 66% likelihood, you can have a different kind of likelihood when you talk about carbon budgets and scenarios and so on. But if you want to meet it with a 66% likelihood, according to this climate scenarios, you can derive carbon budgets. Okay, and a carbon budget basically means how much emissions can you emit, how much can you put into the atmosphere in terms of carbon dioxide before you induce 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I'm taking these numbers from the latest IPCC special report on 1.5 degree warming. So it's very recent numbers, updated budgets. If you want to look at the carbon budget for 2 degrees Celsius, you have to go to older sources, basically. So let's do that exercise. The carbon budget for the period 1850, pre-industrial times, according to this logic, up until the end year 2100 is approximately 2,620 gigatons. Lots of uncertainties, give and take, plus and minus, and so on and so forth, but roughly in the median budget estimate. With that, we can look into scenarios that achieve this budget or stays within this budget, which is what I'm going to present to you right now. Already today, or up to 2017 at least, we have emitted 2,200 gigatons. So we have 420 to go. And we emit about 42 gigatons per year right now. This is from 2016, I think, or 2017 even. So in 10 years, we will have depleted the budget completely. So we'll have to have 0 emissions by 10 years to stay within these budgets. Even in the integrated assessment models, the very idealized welfare maximizing models, this cannot be achieved. So what the models do is basically when they construct scenarios, they introduce a period of lending. So you emit more than the budget allows, running us into a budget deficit. And then it introduces a period of payback. Okay? From 2050 roughly onwards, you're supposed to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere on levels that's sufficient to bring us back to budget balance by budget closure in 2100. And this is done primarily through something called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is a presently uncommercial technology and largely unproven technology, and turning deforestation rates into afforestation rates globally. The level of removals required in the scenarios range from 100 to 1,000 gigatons. And why is there such a big difference? Well, it depends on whether the scenario looks much like this one, which is one end of the extreme. You have really, really rapid emission reductions in the coming decades, basically turning into vegan diets globally to a very high extent. Also reducing your demand for energy so that the energy system actually is shrinking. Really ambitious climate policy. In these kinds of scenarios, you only need global afforestation. You don't have to rely on BECCS. On the other hand of the spectrum, you continue along the path we are on right now, continue demanding energy at high levels and so on, which means that we need to solve this through technology to a much higher extent, which is these kinds of scenarios then have to rely on bioenergy with carbon capture and storage to a much higher extent. That's the range of the different kinds of scenarios, two ends of scenarios, of the scenario range. But in both cases, 1.5 degrees Celsius is theoretically possible. That's the conclusion. It's possible, theoretically speaking. Now I'm going to give sort of a sneak peek view of where we stand today in terms of warming and emissions and so on, and then look into the global ambition, the ambition of the global politics right now. Oh, you probably know about these kinds of graphs comparing pre-industrial temperature, global average temperature to present day global average temperature. We are approaching 1 degree warming globally. This data is 25 to 2015, the average in that period. With the two last years, we are actually almost on 1 degree warming. And if we look into emissions, this is without land use change and forestry because we don't have that old data. But the emissions have been from a very low level in pre-industrial times to very high levels and continuing to grow. And also if you look into the details of this, focusing more on the 1950s onwards, it's also becoming very clear that in 1992, when we agreed on the Framework Convention, the world looked very different from 2015 when we agreed to the Paris Agreement. So today it's very obvious to everyone involved in this process that we are not going to solve this if it's only concerning parts of the world. We need to engage all parts of the world, not only selected parts of the world, to make this possible with all the challenges that that poses. Okay, so it's theoretically possible according to the scenarios, but it's really, really, really complicated to realize, to turn this into zero emissions in 10 years or net zero emissions by 2015. So let's then look at the means that we have to our disposal at international level. And this is also not news to most of you, that the sort of the primary tool in the Paris agreements are the nationally determined contributions. So states are obliged to submit nationally determined contributions now every 5 years, we can say, to update them and to have at least as an ambitious NDC that they update compared to the previous one. So the idea is to ratchet up the ambition over time. If we look at the intended nationally determined contributions pre-Paris, they were submitted from almost all parts of the world, and today we have at least 183 ratifications. I haven't checked this morning, but we have a lot of ratifications of these NDCs. So almost all countries are on board, basically, with some exceptions like Russia is an important exception. We have Turkey and Iran, Iraq and so on. Okay, and then we also, of course, you're aware of this, we have some setbacks. Trump represents this when he talked about the Paris Agreement only marginally or to a tiny, tiny bit, something like that, affecting temperature, but affecting the US economy very much. So he decided, or he decided that the US would withdraw from the Paris Agreement as soon as they can withdraw from the Paris Agreement, which is still some time in the future. Now Bolsonaro is another important example in Brazil that we should pay attention to. But largely speaking, the sort of political thrust behind the Paris Agreement is very strong and positive. Okay, so let's look at where we are today with the NDCs that have been promised, and then I will conclude. So these are the kinds of scenarios from the IPCC 1.5 degree report. I showed you the extreme ones, this one and this one, basically. Both ends of the scales of scenarios. If we compare that, or if we look into them, they basically say that we need to reach net zero emissions by 2050. We can compare that to the most ambitious climate policy in the world, or climate law in the world, which is the Swedish one, saying that we should achieve net zero emissions by 2045. That's the most ambitious we have right now, but it sort of gives you an idea of how big this challenge actually is. You probably are well aware of the Swedish ambitious target and all the problems or all the challenges that faces us when we try to implement it. This is the global ambition. If you try to lump all the NDCs together, which is a very hard exercise to do, you get to something like 50 to 58 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents by 2030, or 2020 to 2030 actually. Which means that emissions will increase from today if all the countries implement their NDCs completely. And this can be, of course, compared then to the median scenario for 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is done in the IPCC report, saying that there is if you have full implementation of NDCs and compare it to the median scenario for 1.5 with a 66% likelihood, there is an emission gap of approximately 27 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2030, which is of course then saying that we will move into the least ambitious mitigation scenario in near term, requiring even more negative emissions in the long term. A complicated puzzle. Okay, this is my final slide then, and again Adam already alluded to some of this, that in Katowice, we will agree or try to agree to something called the Paris Agreement's work program. I think it's the official title, but I tend to call it the rule book, as Adam did, because it's actually what it is. The Paris Agreement is very vague, of course, as these kinds of treaties tend to be. And what's now under negotiations is to how to interpret the agreement, or how to turn the market mechanism or the transparency framework or things like that into actual operational rules, basically. So that's a really important topic for COP24. The COP is, this COP is supposed to adopt this rule book. It's going to be a hard challenge, given that there is no negotiating text as of yet. And then there is also the issue of pre-2020 ambitions. That we are, if we lump up the NDCs and if we look at the current mitigation endeavor globally, we are not aligned with the cost-efficient scenarios for meeting either the 2-degree target or the 1.5 degree target. Also, the Kyoto Protocol's Doha Amendment, for example, has not been ratified or has not turned into force, which is something that concerns lots of countries as well. I'm going to leave the floor open there because I think the panel now can discuss this much more in detail. Right, Adam?
Thank you so much. Please. Yes, that's partly what we will try to do. So first, let me just bring the panel up to the table. Mathias, please. And then also, I will introduce Johanna Lissinger Peitz, the chief negotiator for Sweden, and also Maggie White from Swedish Waterhouse. So please give them a warm hand.
This works too?
Please, go ahead.
Is this on? Okay.
So now we have a lot of things that we can potentially talk about, and we will try to find the most efficient way of doing this. So with all of these pieces of information in mind, from you, Mathias. Let's start where you left off, with a focus on this specific COP24, and then go a bit broader. You mentioned the rule book and the ambition part of this conference, which I think is very helpful to have those two tracks. This is what it's all about in Katowice. So I would want to start with you, Johanna. You are the chief, and you are free to explain this, you are the chief negotiator for Sweden, but also for the EU in a specific track. I will let you present that, but that's very important, and we will return to it later. But after you have done that, please give your take on these two tracks as part of the issues at hand ahead of us at COP24.
Thank you very much, Adam. It is on.
It's not on here. It's supposed to. It's for the live stream.
Well, it's for the live stream, but also for the people who are in the room in the back. Can you hear me?
It's only for the live stream.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much, and that would be even better. Great. But I still need to use both, or?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh.
Two streams.
Okay.
Technology.
Okay. So, for those who have not met me, which I think is quite a few, because for me it's a lot of new faces in the audience here. My name is Johanna Lissinger Peitz. So, as you said, I'm the Swedish chief negotiator, which means that when the minister is not present at the meeting, I lead the Swedish delegation. And it also means that when we, within the EU, develop our EU position, because when we are in the negotiations, the EU negotiate as one, with shared competence between member states and the Commission. So I represent Sweden in developing the EU position, but as Adam also said, I'm one of 3 EU lead negotiators, covering climate finance and means of implementation. So the EU in the negotiations are represented by 3 colleagues of mine, or 2 colleagues of mine from Germany, Commission and Sweden. So that's how we are represented in the negotiations. But maybe just to pick up on your question, and I wrote down a few things also during the presentation. I don't know if you want me to react shortly to those now also. Good. But I will start with the last picture, and I very much agreed with Mathias that the rule book is, I think, at the center and at the heart of the COP24. And the question then is, so why is the rule book so important? We have the agreement, so why are you still negotiating, and why is the rule book important? And this comes back to, I think, what Mathias said also. The Paris Agreement is a bottom-up agreement, which builds on parties' contribution, which are nationally determined. And in any system that is nationally determined and which build on a bottom-up approach, you need those rules to be able to track progress, to be able to compare commitment between different parties, and to be able to make sure that we are making progress over time and that the parties are delivering on what they have said that they will be delivering. So that to me is the very important reason why the rules are important. Very easily explained, I usually say that in Paris we agreed to what, with the 3 goals that was talked about: mitigation, adaptation and finance flows. And in Katowice we will decide on how are we going to implement those. Which also means that a lot of the ambiguity that we could not agree upon, well, we agreed upon it in Paris, but we have different interpretations on some of the text, tends to come back now. So for those of us who are in Paris, it's a little bit of seeing the same patterns and hearing some of the same positions. The one thing that I think I missed on the last slide, you talked about the rule book, and you had the pre-2020 dialogue, but I would also say that next to the rule book, I think for us the most important thing is the Talanoa event. And shortly explained, Talanoa was a term that is introduced by the Fijian presidency. It's community-based decision-making in the Pacifics that they have introduced as a new element to the UNFCCC. and which was, I think, very skeptical for many, but has been very well received. In short, it addressed 3 questions. Where are we? Where do we want to go? And how do we get there? That has been a technical process throughout the year. At the COP, it will now be a political moment where the ministers are represented to talk about these 3 issues. So for Sweden, I would say next to the agreement of a robust and dynamic rulebook, the Talanoa dialogue and a strong outcome on that will be essential. And I don't need to give you the explanation. I think you have all read the newspapers on the IPCC report and the 1.5 degree report, which is giving the justification of the importance of that. I'm not going to hijack the microphone, but let me just check if there's anything else that I just want to touch upon now. I think I leave it for that for the time being, and then I will come back. Maybe one thing that you talked about, and that is, again, you said that it's the Paris Agreement is a weak agreement, but on the other hand, it does involve almost all parties in the world. I think it was unprecedented with the speed that the agreement was ratified and entered into force, which provides some challenges for us as negotiations, because we thought we would have until 2020 to agree the rule book, and we had only had to 2018, and that makes a difference. But I think also the ownership that comes with the bottom-up approach is extremely important for ownership and implementation on country level. So sometimes you have to weigh this to top-down, high ambition, but not necessarily the same ownership, or bottom-up approach, maybe a stronger ownership and a stronger implementation on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very good and extensive answer. So we will now, I think, pass this on and also use that one. So thank you also, Johanna, for mentioning the Talanoa dialogue, which is part of the ambition track, as I see it. Thank you so much, because I was going to mention it after, now I don't have to. I can just add that in this phase, in the year before the political dialogue, there has been a technical process, but there has also been a kind of participatory process in which...
Participatory.
Okay, thank you. You all got that live stream? Thank you. So in that phase, the Fiji presidency that has instigated the Talanoa part of this dialogue, they have encouraged us as stakeholders to participate and come and do our own Talanoa dialogue events. From our part, we have done this, both in the spring and now before this COP, and we have sent in submissions, and that has been a very important thing for us to engage in the process with. And this is a transition to the next question, which is the sub-theme, as I said in the introduction, the role of NGOs and stakeholders interacting with the COPs. Talanoa dialogue is just one thing, but we have to find all the possible channels that we can to influence the politics and the negotiations. So I want to turn first to you, Maggie, representing SIWI, Swedish Waterhouse. We will come soon to your specific niche, in the COP sphere, which is the water issues. But first of all, your perspective on the role of NGOs and stakeholders, and whether or not we are actually included and can actually play a role and have an effect.
Thank you. Actually, thank you for that presentation on the UNFCCC and the COP. Very interesting and very pedagogical, so not very easy to apprehend. There was one thing that was missing for me, is that when we talk about the other parties or the non-stakeholder party and process, of course, all the conventions have observers, and that's what you were representing, I think, in the numbers also. So yourself, you are an observer, SIWI is an observer, we all have different groups. You have the research group, which is SIWI is a part of, the youth, the businesses, the indigenous, the women. So they are all observers and can attend the COP, but also all those different subsidiary groups that work, like the Adaptation Committee or the Standing Committee on Finance. And that's pretty consistent in majority of the conventions. What was interesting, and this actually started in Peru, is I think it was opening up to other stakeholders. So we had the Lima-Paris action agenda that was initiated during the COP20 that took place in Peru, and that was formalized at COP21. And this participatory spirit of Paris was because it was opening up to other stakeholders, to this global climate action agenda, bringing them into somehow the discussions, not the negotiations. That's very much linked to the countries, and there we can go in as observers and we can make recommendations through the different constituent groups, such as research or youth or business. But I think what was very strong in Paris, and then the Moroccans picked up even stronger on, we had two amazing champions, which was Laurence Toubiana and Akima Helaite, which were the two strong negotiators and ensuring the presidency of the COPs also. And I think that's also interesting in the COP spirit, is the country that hosts the COP. What is the landmark? How are they trying to influence or leave something with that COP? And I think COP21 and COP22 was also about opening up to other stakeholders. Because in the gigatons that you were talking about with the CO2 emissions, I have another number, which is if you put together all the nationally determined contributions, you are up to 0.4 degrees. So the recognition was to say countries cannot do it alone. We need to have all the stakeholders come on board. It's a global issue, but solutions are at the local level, and therefore who is at the local level? It's cities, it is the private sector, it is NGOs, it is research institutions. So having them come on board to discuss in this process of what can be the solutions for implementing the Paris Agreement was very refreshing and interesting, and has created a lot of dynamics also. So that's the Marrakesh Partnership Action Agenda, which was initiated, as I mentioned, with COP20, then reinforced at COP21 in Paris, full-blown at COP22 in Marrakesh, in Morocco. And that also, the Fijians picked it up and became the Talanoa Dialogue. So that was what's interesting, is actually bringing in the other stakeholders to discuss with parties in these roundtables about ways forwards and solutions to influence potentially the rule book and how do we go forward. So it's an ongoing process. It has opened up. I do agree that some countries are for and very willing, others are a bit reticent. It's already very complicated when you have to negotiate by consensus, so any new kind of language coming in makes it very difficult. COP21, as you mentioned, and Johannes mentioned, also opened up the world to adaptation. Before we spoke about CO2 emissions, now we have to talk about adaptation. What is adaptation compared to sustainable development, to international cooperation? What does it mean in our own countries also? So it does raise a lot of questions and issues, and it does complicate the discussions. Who's responsible for what? Who should pay for what? So I think that is the challenge that we have now in maintaining the Paris Agreement spirit, as we call it, which is supposed to be inclusive, open, and very ambitious. 2 less years to actually agree upon it does make it more difficult. But it has opened up those avenues, and there are more tracks. We do talk more about human rights-based approach, definitely in the text. It's in the Paris Agreement, but what does it mean when you implement? And that becomes much more difficult. So the implementation phase is really what makes it very complicated and creates a lot of tension, and also lots of difficulties in coming to that consensus of agreement. So unfortunately, it does bring it at a lower level of ambition. But what was interesting is that when Trump said that he was going to pull out, who stepped up in the States? The private sector and the cities. And I was actually talking to the general director of the Green Climate Fund, who said that he was getting phone calls from cities or companies saying, how can we send you money to continue the work and to make up for the amount that the states would not be contributing to the Green Climate Fund? He wasn't able to receive that money because the Green Climate Fund is supposed to receive money from public, from states, from bilateral, multilateral entities. But it was interesting to see that momentum being created. So the big issue we have now is time. It really is that acceleration that we're seeing more and more. We see with the IPCC report coming out. How do we make that meaningful change in the short time that we have left is the big question. But we need to do it together. And I think that's what's interesting within the Paris Agreement, that it has opened up the avenues, and that stakeholders can come on board and we can find solutions for the implementation part. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to, because this is an important topic to kind of understand the entire structure of things, and thank you I said in the introduction that this needs to be solved internationally yes, on a political level, we need to have the international dialogue, but exactly as you say, the solutions are also definitely in other parts of the spectrum. But Mathias, just give your take on this question that you also touched upon in your presentation, and the challenges that are posed for us stakeholders that are trying to interact, and any tips that you see. Interpret it openly.
Okay, no, I think I just agree to what you said. There are so many different roles for the NGOs to play. They are the critical examiners and the watchdogs of what states are sort of putting forward. They are the facilitators that provides new ideas and come up with compromise proposals and new language, even though it's hard with new language, and so on and so forth. They are also communicating out from the COPs, but they are also lobbying inwards towards national delegations and so on. So they fill so many different roles and functions. Important stakes are represented by NGOs, gender constituency, farmers, indigenous peoples, and so on and so forth, to make sure that we don't forget important dimensions of climate change. And so yeah, it's very important. Of course, there are challenges for NGOs to engage with this process. We know that there has been some law put forward in Poland, for example, that makes it harder to demonstrate. That's of course a challenge of these kinds, and also the fact that if you don't, as an NGO, have access to a party, sort of being nominated via a party, it's getting increasingly hard to get access to the conference as such, because the party delegations are becoming larger and larger. As I mentioned, I showed the figures before, 15,000 party representatives in Marrakesh. Of course, not all of them are negotiators, not all of them are even normally state representatives, but they are NGOs sort of under state cover, which is possible in some countries and not in others, and so on. So there are, of course, some challenges also for NGOs. But I think this process is unusually open to NGOs. I really appreciate that, and I think it's something that other processes can learn from. It's a good example, actually.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Johanna. I was going to send it. Your perspective from the party side of things.
From the party side. No, but I think, for me, I think 2015, with the agreement of the Sendai framework, Addis Ababa, Agenda 2030, and the Paris Agreement, was a bit of a shift in how the UN involve civil society and other actors, which my personal view is I don't think we would have had the Paris Agreement, I don't think we would have Agenda 2030 without a very strong involvement of civil society, private sector. Not just for the reasons mentioned here, but I mean, if we take the example of the Paris Agreement, it's not just the involvement at the COP itself. For most countries, when they developed their NDC, they also had national consultations with civil society, in many cases in an area on climate energy that would not necessarily have happened before. So it's also the process of involving not just at the COP, but sometimes even more importantly before actually coming to the COP also. So that's I think one aspect of it. And then, of course, when you have a representation from, for example, a certain sector, showing that the technology are there, the solutions are there, it is slightly more difficult for a party to say that we can't do this because the technology is not there, if you have a side event in the room next to them showing that that exact technology actually are accessible and easily available. For us as a Swedish delegation, we meet with civil society regularly during the sessions and also before the sessions. We have meetings where we focus more on informing both on the Swedish position, but also informing what happens in the room where not everyone has access to. And I think that dialogue is very important to keep the information flow, because we hear and know different things, and that I think to build a very strong team, not just as a delegation, but being able to influence the negotiations as a whole. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. Very good. You mentioned a couple of things in the beginning there, which I think I should explain. You mentioned two other major decisions being taken that year of 2015. First one being, apart from the Paris Agreement, first one being Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And the second being the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and that is about development finance, basically. And also the Sendai framework, but let's keep it to these three. They all connect together in a very important way. And I would like to now go to the next question to you, Maggie, because if we somehow miraculously manage to solve the issue of climate change, you would think that it's all good and fine and dandy. But then we actually have 16 more sustainable development goals to solve. It's nice to have challenges as civil society, and you represent one of the other goals, or as SIWI you represent the goal number 6, the water goal, and understanding how the climate change goal and the climate change work connects to other sustainable development goals is very important, also for the COP and for knowing how to move forward together also in the future. But how do you, representing, if I can say, representing another SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, engage with the COP? What are the kind of connection points there?
Well, I think we've come to a point now. Yes, 2015, amazing year where countries came together around these 4 agendas. And then the challenge is, how do you implement them? It always comes down to implementation. And it's very challenging for a country to have so many frameworks that they have to report on and try and implement on. So the idea is, how do you make it easier for countries when it comes to their level? I mean, they don't want to report just for the Paris Agreement or for the 2030 Agenda, for the disaster risk. It's more about, how do I create resilient societies and communities in a sustainable manner? And what is the best entry point for that? So SIWI, Stockholm International Water Institute, in which Swedish Waterhouse is a department, was one of the organizations championing for an SDG 6, and so a Sustainable Development Goal on water, but also saying that we cannot just have standalone goals, because then you're having a sectorial approach to things, and therefore you are not building up in a holistic, integrated way, and we know that everything is connected today. And of course, water for us is, but other sectors will say something else, but water for us is one of the main areas where you can actually connect all the different sectors and different ways of implementing in a more holistic, integrated and efficient way here. So we do have water-related targets in the other SDGs. You can't have healthy ecosystems if you don't have clean water, and you can't have clean water if you don't have healthy ecosystems. You cannot build resilient cities if you don't take into consideration nature-based solutions, and we see that more with the floods that are happening also. You can't ensure food production if you don't have access to water, for example. And at the same time, you can't have clean water if the agricultural impact or pollution on the water resources is not controlled also. So everything is really interconnected, and the climate goal, SDG 13, is not detailed. It refers back to the Paris Agreement, because the 2030 Agenda was adopted before the Paris Agreement also. So what we try to do at SIWI is actually come forward within the 2030 Agenda, but as well the Paris Agreement, with policy recommendations, good case studies showing how you can implement in an integrated way through water for countries, so that they can plan that way also if they want to prioritize the funding, because the funding is not exhaustive. There is money out there, but you need to have good projects also. So, for example, if you look at indirectly here, elements when it comes to water, we have a source to sea approach at SIWI here. Why am I talking about seas and oceans? Because if you have 80% of the polluted waters are being sent into the seas, into the rivers, then you're actually destroying your ecosystem there. And we often forget that our ocean is really our balancing form. It's our balancing body for oxygen production, but also CO2 capture. So if we increase the pollution in the oceans, then we're going to destroy that balancing act that Mother Nature has through the oceans. And we see what's happening with plastics, for example, and that's coming from the land. So we have developed a source to sea approach to really look at that holistic perception and what is upstream and downstream, and living up to that responsibility. Forests and landscapes. We're in Sweden. Forest is a big issue. How do we manage our land also is a big issue. I mentioned cities earlier. We've seen all of the big floods taking place also in cities. If you have nature-based solutions, if you have green infrastructures in your cities, you will reduce the impacts of climate change, or actually reduce the impacts of disasters when they hit upon them. So it's really about raising that awareness if you prioritize water at the center. And then just very basically, when it comes to adaptation and mitigation directly from water, water is a priority in the adaptation chapters of the NDC that were contributed. More than 90% of the countries prioritize water and adaptation chapters. But it's not in the Paris Agreement, so we highlight them. We actually come forward with wise water management solutions when it comes to adaptation, but also mitigation. If you have more efficient water services, then you reduce the energy production needed to deliver the water, or to treat the water also, if you go to more naturally based solutions. And also from wastewater, you can also create clean energy here as well. We want to develop clean energies. You need a lot of water and quality water to do that. So it's really about highlighting the added value that water can bring from the adaptation and the mitigation aspect of things, because it is part of the same coin.
Thank you. So we're painting a picture here of the entire structure. Let's move back towards COP24 now, and I will ask you again, Johanna. As we said earlier, I think it's quite important to repeat that Sweden is not. I've found that many people do not know this, that Sweden is not a party itself to the negotiations, but are negotiating through the EU. And how, from an EU perspective, or like Sweden inside the EU, what is your picture of what Sweden can bring to the table at COP24, and also connecting to the situation that the EU is dealing with up ahead until COP24, a worrying political climate that we will need to deal with somehow. EU wants to be a leader. Is that possible? Are we a leader? And in that perspective, what can Sweden's role be in that? Big question, but we're trying to frame a lot of things in this discussion, and we don't have that much time left. So,
are you doing very well in covering absolutely everything in a short time? Well, maybe just to be quite clear, I think it's important to know that Sweden, of course, is a party to the Convention, to the Paris Agreement, etc.
Yes.
Although we don't negotiate as one country, and it's a slight difference there. An important one, though. I mean, how to be able to respond to the question, just to kind of lay out how the process actually works. So before a COP or before a session in Bonn, we prepare our Swedish position, we do our priorities, we travel to Brussels, we meet with the other member states, the Commission, the Council, and formulate our position. And that's where we have the biggest impact. So when we are at the COP itself, we have an EU position, and I think that's important. For us, the priorities, and I think we have been quite successful in that, is to push for a strong and robust transparency framework, and to push for the dynamic elements of the Paris Agreement. And now I'm going to be a little bit more technical, but the dynamic elements of the Paris Agreement is what we call the global stocktake, which takes part every 5th year, and that's where we see that you have the possibility to raise ambition over time, and we all know that we have to raise ambition over time. So, for example, when the ministers meet at the Council before the COP, these are elements where we push very strongly for. And if I look at the last Council conclusions, we I think were quite successful in getting quite strong text on many of those elements. On your question on what the EU is dealing with now, I'm kind of just clarifying the question, assuming that you're talking about the global geopolitics in general, or yes, okay. There may be other situations that I'm not aware about, but I mean, I think there was a picture here from Trump from the Rose Garden speech, and I think a very common question that I usually get is, the U.S. are they still part of the Paris Agreement? And yes, they are part of the Paris Agreement until I think the day. Is it before or after the next elections? I can't remember right now, but that's actually the day after. Yeah. So it is, of course, a very different political environment than we had in 2015. But Brazil was mentioned, the US was mentioned, but I also think it's a very different situation than we had in 2015, which comes back to the whole discussion we had just now on the importance of civil society, on business and NGOs, which has the years since 2015 created a much stronger political momentum. So I do think that somehow has very much helped to keep up the momentum, to keep up the general political momentum, even if you have a country who have said that they will withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So I think that's one element. Many delegations are very much looking to the EU as a leader, and I think in the COP in where were we last time? In Bonn, Fiji Bonn, as I usually call it, because it was under the Fijian presidency, but we were in Bonn. We had, as the EU, I think, a quite strong leadership role. There is something called the High Ambition Coalition, which is a coalition of countries that is trying to work towards a high ambition. And in that, EU also have a very strong voice. Sweden also have a very strong voice in that. So there are different forums where we can influence the political atmosphere and where we can push for ambition, which is not only what is in the rule book, but it's also raising ambition, for example, as an outcome of the Talanoa dialogue. I don't think anyone is expecting new figures to be put on the table at this COP, but the signals on what can we do more and how can we work together will be, I think, of high importance.
Thank you. Yes, thank you also for clarifying. I can admit I was a bit short there. I would love to clarify more, but we don't have that much time. Thank you so much for that answer. We will now move to the kind of final part of this discussion, and so prepare your questions to this panel because we'll soon reach the Q&A. Sorry. I would just like to finish with some short reflections connecting to what Johanna just said, and start with you, Mathias. So we have a problematic situation geopolitically, and we are trying to handle this through the Paris Agreement negotiations, which is, as you said, a multilateral process based on consensus. What are your hopes for COP24? What are your expectations in this situation?
The transparency framework, I think I agree with Johanna, that's a priority, and I hope that we can...
Would you just very briefly explain?
No, okay, so it's a very complex thing, this transparency framework, because it connects to so many parts of the Paris Agreement. But basically, when I showed you before the graph of where the NDCs takes us, it's a big difference whether it's 50 or 58 gigatons. It's a very big difference, and part of that is because some of the NDCs are conditional upon support. So the countries say, we will do this if you provide support, we will do this if you don't provide support to us. But a huge part of that is also because we don't really know what's in the NDC to begin with. So that's part of the transparency framework, to try to make the NDCs comparable in the end, so that we can monitor progress, basically. So it's about what should be in the NDCs and how should we evaluate the NDCs and so on, and it connects to other agenda items as well. So it's a complex puzzle for the negotiators that I really don't envy them having to go through. But I hope that we can get some of the core sort of decisions made in Katowice on the transparency framework, on other issues as well in the Paris Agreement's rulebook. and then to provide new mandates, of course, because I think that's what's going to happen. Basically, I don't expect that we will have a complete rule book in the sense that it will be very comprehensive and very strong in a sense, or robust. Which is never the case, I guess. It took a long time to negotiate the comparable, what we can call the rule book of the Kyoto Protocol. And then once the rule book was there, which comprises 70 pages compared to the 20-page long Kyoto Protocol, once the rule book was there, of course, negotiations on the rules did not stop. They continue. But as far as possible in Katowice, and to avoid a big resurface of old conflicts that will take us back several years in the negotiations, but to build on the momentum that is actually there beneath the complexity of all the positions.
Well, thank you. Actually, I remembered the structure of this that we will end with some closing statements. So now we are after the Q&A. So I will now go to the Q&A, and you can return to these talks in the end, because we definitely want to prioritize a Q&A. So please, as always, keep it brief and question oriented as much as you can. So we'll start here.
Yeah, hi, my name is. Does this work? Yeah. My name is George de Gooijer. I listened to Johanna just explaining how the preparation goes for the position here in Sweden and then in Europe. I work in Benin, Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, a little bit in Mali, and all these countries have a similar situation, which is they come with very large delegations. The last time I think in Bonn they came with 200 to 300. But what they do not have is a National Institute of Water and Climate. So these countries, they come prepared on the basis of, well, whoever knows something. And when it comes to what Sweden can do in terms of supporting the process, I think it would be to support these national research institutions. Because then these national governments, the parties, would be in a much stronger position. Your question, what can NGOs do? Do the same thing. Inform these these parties in the best possible way. But it starts with at the national level, have the funding, and that's, I think, a global public good, not a national public good, a global public good, have at a national level these capacities available, have the funding available. And what I think a SIWI can do, but also a Stockholm Environmental Institute or a World Resource Institute, is to create the credibility of such an institute. So say, okay, we trust what this institute, this national institute, is doing. If you create such a mechanism, then Johanna has in her negotiations parties that are really parties that are informed. You have a place where you can put your information as an NGO into the system, and then even if they come under the cloak of the national delegations, they come informed and they become part of something. That was not a question.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
An important comment, the capacity building part, very important. So you're free to comment on that, but we'll take 2 more, I think, at this point. So back there, Ahmed.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed. I work as a PR consultant for Vestanda. I've attended several COPs since 2009. And my question is, the recent Carbon Majors report shows that approximately 100 companies around the world have been the source of more than 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. So we know that the private sector has a big role to play, but how can we realistically prevent the participation of the fossil lobby and their interests without compromising transparency?
Thank you so much. The issue of conflict of interest, which we in PUSH have been working on quite a bit. Very interesting. Thank you. So another question. We have another one here at the front.
My name is Bo Elding, and thank you for asking that question. That was one of my questions also. I have a second one, I think, to Johanna. Is it possible to have a bonus-malus system for all these nations that doesn't keep up to their promises? I've been working 40 years with development assistance, and it's very, very common to make promises. But it's very uncommon to meet with these promises in terms of money and all the activities promised. So this is my question. And of course, I have a question for you as well, and that is, what kind of population figures are you basing your statistics for the future on? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you can repeat the questions, I think not everybody in the audience heard them.
I see. Okay, so the first one was on a comment on the need for building capacity in developing countries in terms of strengthening research institutes and different institutions that
Negotiation capacity.
and the negotiation capacity. So different kinds of capacity building to strengthen their capacity to engage with the demands that are put on them by the Paris Agreement in terms of raising NDCs. And the second one was on how we need business engagement in the transition on climate change, but we also don't want big polluters to kind of put brakes on the development. How do we prevent that effect from appearing, since they have tremendous muscle that, for example, other stakeholders do not have? And we had two questions in here. The first one, please, would you repeat that in a kind of brief manner? I'm sorry.
The smaller system now introduced in Sweden regarding cars. Can you apply that in order to have the states pay for promises they haven't met regarding money?
Yes.
Because each time you have your meetings, you have to make up the backbone of what didn't happen since we met last.
Yeah.
And that is very cumbersome in the future.
Okay.
So is it possible to punish them who doesn't meet with the demands and pay them who does in a way so they can get more interested in contributing?
So a bonus-malus system inside the COP. How to create compliance, basically, it's about how to comply with the Paris Agreement. Is there any kind of punishment that we can use? A sanction-based system.
That it was the population.
Yes, the population question. So we have 4 questions. If we don't have time, you will get one of those questions answered. Please, who wants to start?
Shall I start with the easy?
Go ahead. Yes,
the population
low-hanging fruits.
Yeah, that's the easy one, because it's basically these scenarios that are run with the integrated assessment models. They operate under different, let's say, stories of how the future will develop. So in some of these stories, the population is increasing not so strongly. In others, they increase very strongly. And then given these different core assumptions or framework assumptions, the models are run to see whether the goals can be met or how the goals can be met. In some cases, the goals cannot be met under some circumstances. So, for example, typically when it's very complicated to meet the goals with these models is when you have a very fragmented international political context. You have continuously increasing demands for energy, like we continue to operate and behave as we do today, but we expand this globally. And you have population increase, so that yeah, but and then you can. What is good with this is that it's very transparent. So if you go to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and look at the report, you can find these assumptions, the assumptions behind this sort of the scenarios. So.
Thank you, and yeah.
I leave the tricky questions.
Do you want to try one of the tricky ones?
Thank you very much. I think I'll start with your comment, which was not so much of a question, but it was a very, I think, interesting and important comment. And I'm sure, Maggie, you can fill in a little bit on that. But just, I think, very kind of brief answer. We are engaged in capacity building, both for negotiators and also for institutions, not at least through the financial mechanisms and the capacity in building initiatives there. There are also, I think, different groups, informal groups, which are called Friends of Rules, or we have a group called the Cartagena countries or Progressive Climate Action, where it's a mix of countries with different capacity and different size, trying to analyze the texts of the that is now put on the table together. So that is, if we have more people who are experts in one field and maybe another country have lesser expert there, we are somehow sharing our own delegation capacity with like-minded countries to try to build that momentum also. And then on the different institutions, I'm sure Maggie will respond to it. And thank you for raising the issue on conflict of interest, which has been, I think, a present issue the last 3-4 meetings, at least in the climate negotiations. And we, of course, understand the sensitivity around this. There are, however, rules in the rules of procedures for observers. And I think introducing additional criteria for who can be an observer or not, I don't think that's a feasible way forward. And I think it's also the issue of sometimes you may also have to involve the ones that are causing the biggest challenges. So I think one also need to think about what are the drawbacks with potential criteria and excluding certain representatives. It's also quite clear in the system, if you are an observer, you have the name and your affiliation, so you actually know who you are talking with. Which also, I think, allows the transparency, knowing who actually is behind the badge and who is representing at the certain issue. And then on the issue on, well, if it's possible to introduce a bonus-malus system, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to respond to that question. But if I take the broader approach of what you, Adam, was talking about in relation to compliance, how do we actually make sure that there is some kind of compliance system in place to follow up on the action? It may not necessarily be looking exactly at the same as the Swedish bonus-malus. I think that would be quite difficult to introduce in a multilateral context. But there are... there is something called the Article 15 Committee, and it's quite interesting actually, because in the Paris Agreement the articles doesn't have a name. If you look in other conventions, I used to do other conventions before, you have, you know, compliance, you had finance, you had technology transfer, but the Paris Agreement, it's called the Article 15, Article 9, which doesn't necessarily help the communication of the agreement, but that's how it is. So the Article 15 Committee is the committee for facilitating implementation and compliance. And one of the issues that are now being discussed as part of the rulebook is how will this committee function? What are the kind of triggers that will be able to be used? And there are different kind of triggers in the sense of, is it only a self-trigger? So a country say, I'm not in compliance with my commitments, and therefore you have a case for the compliance committee, or can there be other triggers? And there are everything from NGO triggering a case in the compliance committee to the committee in itself triggering it. So that is one of the things under discussion. I just came back from meetings in Africa with different countries, and for some, I think the naming and shaming is a very difficult issue, and the whole idea with the Article 15 committee, and I think the fact that we actually have an Article 15 committee, is that it should be facilitative and non-punitive in its nature, which is also part of the text. So yes, there needs to be some kind of compliance, there needs to be a mechanism to follow up. The measures for those are rather facilitating and enhancing the implementation than anything else. I think those were the three areas. I hope I touched on all of them, but I will leave to Maggie to maybe comment on the institutions also.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if, when it comes to the delegations, and as Johanna's explained, it's often too late by the time you get to the COP or to the intercession. So what's interesting is what happens in the countries, and we often forget that there is the UNFCCC focal point in each country. That different sectors can go to. often when we go to well, no. What I'm saying is that they are an entry point, and often the delegations at the COPs is mainly the Minister of Environment. You're not going to see the Minister of Water. He might end up in the Global Climate Action Agenda. That's where I have Ministers of Water coming to these events that we're organizing. So I think it's the process of what's happening also in the country and the dialogue within the country that's interesting. It's also
Minister of Environment and the Minister of Transport, at least in Africa, because the Minister of Transport is the one doing the meteorological institution. Because the meteorological institution is the one only being used by the airfield. So normally what you see in Africa is you've got two ministries dealing with climate change. One is the one for environment, the other one is the one for transport. Those are the ones that you will see in combination with UNDP.
yeah. And where I think that knowledge can be shared and enhanced is actually looking at the mechanism that the Green Climate Fund has opened up, which is the readiness programs, which enables different sectors and actors to work together and prepare a funding proposal for the GCF. And there's funding to enable actors to engage in that also. So there are some mechanisms that exist and not perfect, and they have to be perfected because these are all new processes also. But it is an interesting entry point. And yes, SIWI, we do work with institutions and research institutions, but also UNDP in the countries. And we are trying to explore how to enhance this multi-sectorial and multi-dialogue, because that's what is needed at the national level. On the bonus malus, just on that remark, I think it's actually one of the questions we thought we would address is what's the point of multilateral negotiations or conventions? But I think having countries come and share where they're at. We spoke about the transparency framework. We were following a lot the Paris Agreement implementation workstream, which is the APA, and under that there was the adaptation communication. And where things got bottlenecked was about what do we disclose on and how. And so that's where you get, I wouldn't call it the shame one, but you could also be the inspiring one. So that's when countries say what they're doing and not doing. And it's actually their peers that are actually seeing what is being done. So the multilateral processes can push in a certain positive way. I think if we have bonus malus, a lot of countries would not sign up or would not engage also. So I think that's the balance that we have to come to. On conflict of interest, it's an interesting one because at the Bonn intercession in May, and as Johanna said, it's been a discussion that's been ongoing. Then there's been petitions about excluding the different entities or companies that can do strong lobbying and in their interest. And you could think, I mean, one of my closing statements was about, is there a conspiracy now behind the Paris Agreement? When I spoke about the COPs carrying the spirits of the presidencies, Poland, Brazil, okay? What's going on? And there are some conspiracy theories going around also. But again, if we look at China, biggest polluter, but also the ones that have invested a lot in renewable energies also. So sometimes it is the ones that have the highest impact that at one point realize that they can't continue business as usual. If not, they're putting themselves in danger, whether it's at the country level or even a private sector. And some of the biggest polluters are also the ones who are trying to innovate in new ways because they think 50 years ahead. Many countries or politicians only think about their managers, so it's 4 years or 8 years ahead, but companies have to think 50 years ahead. So some of them are initiating things, some of them are initiating things to hide them and put them under also. But I mean, it's a movement, and I think that's what's interesting. And unfortunately, we are depleting our resources, we are polluting them. The earth cannot regenerate completely itself. So at one point, if that impacts business as usual, then I believe companies will think about new solutions of how to clean their mess also, because financially that's what it comes down to for them too. Thank
you so much. Very important and broad issues here. We have, as I said, been working on the conflict of interest issue, and we will keep doing so at COP24. So follow our work, and I'm sure our colleagues and your colleagues will do the same. So I think we have... we don't have time for more questions actually, because Johanna most of all is a busy person and she needs to leave exactly at 5. But we have discussed a wide array of subjects here today, and we will keep on discussing. And now I will leave it for the panel to give their closing statements, and you are free to, for the ones who can stay, please approach us afterwards and have a talk. But now, with everything we've discussed, please give us your perspectives on the way ahead of COP, and the kind of situation we'll be dealing with then, the multilateral forum with all its drawbacks or challenges, I should say, and also the way ahead possibly, and like connect to anything that you feel hasn't been raised up until now, and please go ahead. Who wants to start?
I can start.
Yes.
I already did start before.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to give some additional remarks before I pass the mic on. And basically, I'm just hoping that that we will not fall back on old positions in Katowice, but that we will build on what we have done for the last 2 years, where we have some informal text and some progress and some areas where compromise is being sort of developing, and that we can lock that into a decision in Katowice and move forward from that decision and continue building the rule book up until 2020. So and also to remind everyone that you should not expect very ambitious politics given the circumstances of how this particular forum operates. So a strong foundation, but a robust one in the sense that Johanna also mentioned, that once you have decisions, they are legitimate because they have come about through a process where everyone has had a veto, almost veto power. So that creates a really strong foundation for all of you to go out and push other actors to increase the ambition, which has also been mentioned several times. Okay.
Thank you so much.
We haven't spoken about climate justice. Unfortunately, yes, the ones that suffer the most from the impacts of climate are the ones who are the least responsible for the state we're in. I mentioned that in the Paris Agreement we do talk about human rights-based approach, the indigenous, the gender, the youth. They are mentioned there. But what does it mean when it comes to implementation? And I just really hope, I mean, we're not going to bring in new language. This is language that's in the Paris Agreement. I hope that because it's difficult, because we want to preserve what we have, I hope that that will not be forgotten, the human rights-based approach. And then when we look about how do we implement it, that is really taken into consideration. How do we deal with traditional knowledge also, because you have sources of solutions there also. How do you innovate also with those traditional knowledge? How do you involve all of the stakeholders? So I really hope that human rights-based approach will not be put on the side because negotiations and discussions are difficult. And I often think about Einstein sometimes, who says that we can't solve the problems of the world with the same minds that created them. So I hope that we will continue having a renewal of people going to the COPs and the negotiations. There was a decision at COP23 to increase female representatives throughout the whole UNFCCC process, because it's very male, white dominated. I'm sorry, but we're in Sweden. I can say that without being hit on the head. That's not what I'm used to in other countries I used to work in. But I think there's a renewal of the negotiators, but there's also a renewal in the way we think about the solutions we have. We are also at a time in our societies where it is globalized information about information, technology, innovation. We have amazing startups. We have unicorns, everywhere. There are very interesting niches. And I really hope that we will think differently, because we do have solutions to the problems that we have today. So really think with a different mindset and a different paradigm.
Thank you so much.
Difficult to come after those very wise words. Just to start, 4 points, I think, picking up on what you said, Mathias, that you hope that we are not falling back into our positions. A few weeks ago, I attended the pre-COP in Krakow, hosted by the Polish incoming presidency. I have to say that I was actually encouraged by the messages that we heard from the ministers at that meeting, where there was an open mind, there was a listening to positions and trying to understand and trying to find landing grounds. I'm not saying this is going to be easy, but I think there was a strong message of encouragement and a very strong signal to the negotiators that you will have to find the solutions and the compromises. I think that's positive. Those words matters, not to be mistaken for easy. Second point, there has been some words about COP presidencies and differences. I think the issue or the example with Peru a few years ago is very interesting. Talking to some of the colleagues from Peru, they often talked about how hosting a COP actually enabled them and changed the whole way that the government worked and approached climate change. And one should not forget these actually reasons behind also, and that does matter. Adam, you talked about the challenges and obstacles of the multilateral process. Maybe it comes with my work and position. I prefer to talk about the opportunities that we have. And I think, there's no one who has an illusion that the UNFCCC process, the UNFCCC, the convention, the agreement, that is not going to solve everything, but it is an important foundation. Christiana Figueroa said that in Paris we took a deliberate decision on a paradigm shift, and while it may go with different speed, we have starting the ball rolling, and it will continue to roll. Sometimes there's a little bit uphill, but it's also I think on the right track, and it's an iterative process. We negotiate in the context of the UNFCCC process. We go home, we talk to our stakeholders, and every time something happened in each of the different forums. And I think that together is actually what is creating the change. The last point I think would be, and now I'm going to assume that most of you who are here are interested in the issues. You are also interested in negotiations. So maybe try to think about and this is going to be very COP24 specific, but maybe you should try to think about what is your elevator speech for why does rules matters, because I think that's a very important issue. It's not an easy issue. I think for me it is because we have a bottom-up approach. We need to be able to compare, to track progress and to follow up. So when we take stock in a few years from now, we know where we are in relation to our goals that we have set for ourselves. And that, I think, is extremely important to remain trust between parties, but also for the agreement as such in the multilateral context. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So we have discussed so many things today. Let me just give my concluding remarks and start by connecting to what you said. Obviously, there are hopefully advantages within the and opportunities. I totally agree in the multilateral system, and that's why all of us also are engaging with it, coming from an NGO think tank perspective. And that's very important to say, and I really hope that we can together, out of the things that we have talked about today, see clearly both the challenges ahead, because we need to take them seriously and try to deal with them, but also engage constructively. That's very important. And I would just like to thank you by saying, I would like to connect back to the compliance thing. We're talking about facilitating implementation of compliance. Basically, that means how do we get things done? How do we get countries on board in normal English? And one aspect that was mentioned was the blame and shame mechanism. And as we have alluded to, the Paris Agreement in some ways is a weak agreement, in the sense that is like the strongest way of compliance that we have, the blame and shame mechanism, like blaming countries who don't and shaming them who don't follow along on the rules and on the action. And that's also what we are trying to follow when we go down there. And so please, I can just ask you very humbly and kindly to follow us, and to please engage with the NGOs going there, and to also engage with maybe through us with the delegation that is represented by Johanna here today. And I have enormous trust in you, and I hope that we all put our trust in Johanna, no pressure, to do the best we can together. It's a process that we work on together. As allied. We all feel in our hearts the impacts of climate change worldwide. We all want to use our voices to raise the issue, and we want to help solving it with our brains. And sessions like this, in which we can have this very, very important dialogue, are so crucial and so valuable. So with that, I would just like to thank the arrangers of this event, and thank everyone who followed on the live stream, and everyone who was here in the audience, and of course our wonderful panel, and give them all a big hand. Thank you very much.